Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today. We are just going to give it another couple of minutes to give people a chance to jump on, and we'll get started shortly. Hello again, everyone. Thanks for joining. We still have a couple of people getting connected and logging in from the waiting room. We'll just give it another minute or two, and then we'll get started. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining. Again, people are just logging on. We'll just give it another minute or two, and then we'll get started. Okay, everybody, thank you for making the time today. We're going to go ahead and get started with our refresher training about expense entry and payment requests. So I appreciate everyone making the time. Just to let you all know, this is being recorded, and the slides will be made available to you at the end of the slides will be made available, as well as the recording will be made available to you at the end of today's session. So to get started, we wanted to first dive into a couple of things. Today, the main objective is to get a better understanding of how to review your budget, making sure you know how to create expense records, with the ultimate objective being able to submit payment requests. So today, we're going to take a look at how to do all those things, in addition to being able to edit and resubmit any payment requests that may be rejected. At the end, we will have some time for any questions. Also want to point out a couple of things in terms of the AmpliFund Resource Center and our customer support site. I really only have one slide that I wanted to go through before we dive into the demonstration today. And this slide includes a process flow. If we focus our attention to the bottom half of the process flow over here, then you'll see some of the actions that you're going to be responsible for performing within the system. When it comes to creating a reimbursement payment request, you'll be able to log into AmpliFund and you will be able to create that reimbursement payment request utilizing date ranges of your expenses. So I'll show you how to use and navigate between some of the different date ranges in order for you to select a specific range of expenses to include and roll into your reimbursement request that you'll be submitting to your grant manager at IDDEQ. Along with that payment request should be accompanied expenses. That would be, one expense per source document. The payment request should include attachments that include kind of one upload that has all source documentation for your expenses. And you'll be able to submit that. The DEQ team will be approving it through AmpliFund. And then once you've submitted a payment request through the system, those at DEQ will get a notification that that payment request has been submitted. They will take a decision, whether that's an approval or a rejection. That decision will be communicated down to you as well via an email notification. So you'll be notified as soon as that payment request is either approved or rejected. And then, of course, in the event that for whatever reason the payment request gets rejected, you'll have the ability to review a comment about why it was rejected and go in and make any changes and resubmit if necessary. So we're going to take a look at that process today and how to complete those actions within AmpliFund. And that's what we're going to go ahead and do next. So as I transition and share my screen and we start to dive into AmpliFund, I'll just remind everybody that, again, this session is being recorded. You'll be provided with the slides and the recording following the conclusion of the training session today. And if you have any questions, we will have time for questions at the end of the session. Feel free, though, if you have any questions ahead of that Q&A section, to go ahead and submit those questions either via the chat or the Q&A option within your Zoom window. All right, so getting started here, the first thing that I wanted to do is begin by navigating to our grant. And what I wanted to focus on first is how you can look at your budget and some of the options that are contained within that budget. So in order to navigate to our grant budget, we first have to go to our grant. And to do that, I'm going to go into the grant management section over here in our left navigation menu. I'm going to click on grant management where I can see this drop down, and I'm going to click on grants. Here, you'll be able to see all grants that you're managing from Idaho Department of Environmental Quality. You'll be able to see some key details from within this view, and you'll also be able to click into the grant records to see more options by clicking on the green hyperlinked name of your grant. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to click on the green hyperlink of this test award to get started by looking at this test award. And we're going to see here on this details page, there's going to be a lot of information. There's going to be a lot of financial information here, expenses to date, invoice to date, pending invoices. All of these fields populate as you complete activity within the system. So we're going to take some actions here today in terms of adding expenses and submitting reimbursements. And then we're going to come back to this page to see how these fields have been updated. But first, I wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the budget section and show you some nice tools that will allow you to utilize the budget to help facilitate the management of your grant. So I'm going to go into this post-award drop-down menu here at the top. And I'm going to click on the little drop-down arrow, and I'm going to hover my mouse over financial and click on budget. this is going to take me into the budget that we have set up for this grant. Now, as I'm looking at this budget, you'll notice here's the period of performance start and end date at the top. And as I scroll down a little bit more, you'll see the approved expenditure categories for our grant budget. We do have this option section here, which is going to be really important to utilize. Number one is you'll be able to check any of these boxes to enable information to appear within the budget. So for example, right now I'm seeing this category view of my budget. I can see the different budget categories that I have. I can see the total amounts of those categories. If I wanted to show the line items within this grant budget, then I would be able to check this line items box. And now if I had any type of itemized breakdown within any of these expenditure categories, we would see our line items and the amounts show up here as well. In addition to the line items option, if the grant budget has match as part of its budget, then you'd be able to check the match option here as well. And then now I can see a nice breakdown of any of my grant budget line items that are strictly grant funded, those that are strictly match contributions, or those where, maybe my salaries and fringe contains, grant funds as well as match contributions, and what that total amount that's being budgeted is there. So leveraging these options here at the top of your budget page is going to be really important in terms of kind of seeing the full scope of your grant budget, including how much is budgeted as a total and what's the breakdown of how much of that budget are grant funds versus matching funds. Now, in addition to seeing what your grant budget is, you can also leverage these options to give yourself a good idea of how you're doing in terms of spend to date, as well as how much is remaining. So if I wanted to see how much have I expensed towards each of these items, I can click on the expense actuals box over here. And that's going to show me a breakdown of the total amount of grant funded actuals that I've tracked against all of my categories and line items, as well as any match contributions that I've tracked as well. And then if I check the remaining box, then this really becomes a comprehensive report where not only do I see what's been budgeted, what's been spent, what the division of that is between grant funds and match funds, but I'm also getting an accurate picture of my remaining balances here as well. So feel free to utilize this tool, these options here, as a great budgeting tool. You can also leverage the actuals from and to date as part of your budget and really turn this into a configurable report. So by default, it's going to show you expenses that range the entire lifespan of the grant. But if you just wanted to see a snapshot for a month, let's say I just wanted to see what my August expenses were, then you can leverage the from and the to date fields over here and say, show me my expenses from August 1st all the way through August 31st. And as soon as I've done that, you'll notice that I have updated data here in my actuals. So now it's only showing me what I've spent on expenses within this particular date range. So again, feel free to utilize the budget and the actuals, the remaining, to leverage this as a type of report that you can utilize and that you can view. In addition to that, you'll also be able to export this data by going in your top right-hand corner and clicking on the export button. If you wanted to print this, then again, you can go in the top right-hand corner and locate that print icon and you'll be able to print to a PDF as well. So a few different options here when you're leveraging this budget section in terms of viewing what's been budgeted, viewing what's been spent, viewing what's been remaining, and then as well as if you wanted to get an accurate snapshot from any particular period of the grant of your spend activity for that period by adjusting this actuals from and to date fields over here. So now that we've looked at how you can view the budget and how you can leverage some of the options in order to get that comprehensive level of reporting, I wanted to move on and I wanted to talk a little bit about how we can create a payment request, a reimbursement payment request within AmpliFund in order for you to be able to submit your expenses back to your funder for approval. So in order to get started there, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to navigate to the payment request section by going to the post-award drop-down menu, clicking on cash flow, and clicking on payment request. Here, you'll see a list of any existing or outstanding payment requests. This list will include any activity that you've started, submitted, anything that's been approved or rejected, you will see show up in this list. So I can see that I have 3 payment requests so far. One of them has been approved. 2 of them are still pending a decision. In order for me to generate or create a new payment request, I can go ahead in the top right-hand corner here and click on the plus sign. And this is going to get me started on a page that allows me to begin creating my reimbursement payment request. So let's talk about some of the data and some of the fields that are on this payment request and how we should go about filling this information out. Number 1, you'll see at the top always, who the funder organization is and what your grant name is, which could be particularly useful as you're coming in and navigating this to submit your reimbursement request. Under the payment request name field, here's where you have an opportunity to name your payment request. The guidance and the recommended manner in which we should be naming our payment request here is the award identification number, as well as the number or the version of payment request that you're submitting at this point. So on this one, my award identification number is 123, and this is payment request number 4, because this is the 4th one that I'm submitting now. So again, feel free to use that convention of award identification number, as well as the number or the sequence of payment requests in terms of, which one, how many you've submitted previously, and then following up on that, which is, in this case, this is going to be my 4th entry. The date created is going to default to today's date. You can change this if you want. No matter what you change the date created to, as soon as you submit this, that submission date will be hard-coded and will be locked down. And then here, you'll be able to enter in your date range of expenses in this from and to field. So let's say you're submitting expenses for the month of September. So you can go ahead and utilize this calendar picker to choose your from date and your to date. So I'll do from September 1st through September 30th to identify that I want to pull in all expenses that have a September timeframe in them. You'll also leave this as a reimbursement payment type, as we're submitting a reimbursement type right now. You'll notice the payment request status shows it's not submitted. This will update as soon as we submit this. And then if it gets approved, the status will update to approved. If it gets rejected, it'll get updated to rejected. So this is a hard-coded field that's based on activity that occurs within the system. Once you've filled out these fields at the top, it is time to begin entering in your expenses. So you'll see here, I've identified my date range. I know that I want to request reimbursement on expenses from 9/1 through 9/30. Now I can utilize this plus sign over here to create my expenses for that time frame. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on the plus sign here to get started with creating my expenses. So once I click on the plus sign, this is going to allow me to begin creating my expenses. Please note that we should be adding one expense for each source document on the payment request. So use that as a guide when you're adding in your expenses. The relationship between expenses and source documents is 1-to-1. So I'm going to go ahead and in these top two fields, I can identify the category and the line item that I'm submitting an expense for. So I'll just get started by selecting my equipment category, which then shows me that I can choose my equipment line item. The first thing that we're going to do when we're submitting this expense over here is we're just going to talk about submitting an expense with grant funds only. So no matching funds yet. That'll be our second expense that we enter. Here, I'm going to put the total amount of the expense, $150. You'll see that it'll auto-populate the person that's creating the username of the person that's creating the expense. And what's going to be particularly important about adding in this expense is that it's going to ask you here for the expense date, which should be the date of the source document. So this expense date field is automatically going to default to today's date. However, you can use this calendar picker over here and identify the true expense date. Now, this is also particularly important because we identified that we wanted to pull in all expenses from that September timeframe, meaning that if I want this expense to pull into this reimbursement request, I need to assign it with a September date. And remember, the goal here is that I am submitting a reimbursement for my source document that has a date of source document as, sometime between September 1st and September 30th. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select my source document date over here, put that in as my expense date. The expense status is going to also default to reviewed. Another thing that the reimbursement request is looking to pick up here is expenses that fall within the September timeframe and that are reviewed. So if you want this to roll into this reimbursement request that we're submitting, definitely leave this in a reviewed status. Here in the description field, you should be adding any comments on what was purchased. This explanation is visible to your grant funder at DEQ. So go ahead and type in a description here. I'm just going to type one in as an example. Encourage you to be as specific as possible. So make sure you're filling in this description field with any comments on what was purchased. And here, as we're creating individual expenses, all you have to do is fill out this tab and this information over here. No need to attach any documentation on the expense record. I'll show you where you'll be attaching those items on the reimbursement request itself. So once you have all of your expense detail in here, the total amount of your expense, the expense date that falls within the from and to date that you've identified in the reimbursement request, your expense status is reviewed, and your description includes any comments on what was purchased, you can go ahead and click on the Create button over here. And you'll see that because you've created an expense within this date range, then the expense automatically shows up down here. You'll be able to see the category, the total amount that was expensed. It's showing that it was purely grant funds and there's no match contributions that were included in this expense. And you'll see the total remaining. We'll have a little bit more on the breakdown of this table here in a second. But first, I want to add a second expense. This time, I want to add one that includes one with cash match. So In order to create another expense, I just kind of repeat the same process. I go to this create new expense button and I click on the plus sign. Same concept over here where I'm going to be able to identify the category that I'm expensing this towards and the line item. And as I mentioned previously, I'm going to be creating my expense for my source document that includes both grant funds and matching contributions. So when you're creating an expense that has both grant funds and cash match contributions, it's important to note that this direct cost field here should include the sum total of the grant funds plus the match. So for example, if I'm expensing $200 of grant funds and $100 of that is cash match, then I'm going to put in a total of $300 to account for my $200 of grant funds plus $100 of cash match. If you scroll up here on your financials tab, you'll be able to identify how much of this $300 goes towards your cash match. And you can go to the cash match field over here, click on the dollar button. And again, just as I mentioned before, $100 of this $300 total expense is cash match. And you'll see once I enter that $100 in here, you get a nice breakdown at the top that shows you total amount, $300, $200 is a grant funded expense, $100 is a cash match expense. I'm going to go back to my general tab over here to complete the rest of this expense page. And the rest of this is pretty straightforward. It's the same as what we just looked at. We have our date of source document over here, which should fall in line with our expense date ranges that we entered. So again, I'm going to make sure I enter in a September date so that it rolls in to this September reimbursement request. Status defaults to reviewed, which is good. And I'm going to put in any description or comments on how this money was spent. No attachments are needed on the expense level. We'll be attaching source documents on the request itself. And we now have our second expense that we're going to be submitting reimbursement for. And again, you'll be able to see here, your direct cost should include total amount of grant funds plus match funds. And then you go to the financials tab, go to the cash match amount in order to identify how much of that direct cost is a match amount. Once you have this completed, go ahead and click on the create button to create this expense. And now I can see my second category is populated here in the table, which shows me that I'm requesting $150 out of the equipment category and a total of $300 out of the salaries and fringe category. As we're looking at this table, one thing that's particularly helpful is that for each of these categories, you can see a total amount of what was expensed for the category, how much of that is cash match, how much of that is grant funded, and then what the remaining balance is for the category, the grant funded remaining balance. If you wanted to get take a deeper dive into the expenses, then you click on the category here, and it's going to give you a breakdown of every single expense that was entered within this time frame for this payment request. So here you can see the expense date, which is the date of the source document. Here's the description that you entered on the expense. Here's the total amount. And this is the total amount that's remaining on this category on this line item. You can see the same information for your other categories. And I'll click on this one just so we can see how this looks with the match, where you can identify that a total amount of $300 was expensed. $100 of that is cash match. And this is the grant funded remaining total. You'll also be able to see here at the bottom where we have the breakdowns by category. Here are the totals of all expenses across all categories that have been entered for this payment request within this time frame. So we have a total amount expensed of $450. 100 of that is match funds. $350 of that are grant funds. Here on the requested amount field, you'll be asked to identify and to enter the total amount that you're requesting. So again, this is going to provide us with just the grant funded total as a guide on what we should be requesting. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to type in my 350 here as my requested amount. If you scroll down in this section, we have our additional information where you can enter any comments. So here, feel free to use this free text field to provide any clarity to DEQ about this payment request. If there's anything that in particular that you want them to know about this reimbursement request, feel free to populate these comments. And here on the attachments, this is where you're going to upload your source documentation. What we're asking for here on the attachments tab is one file containing all source documentation. And again, the relationship between the source documentation and the expenses should be 1-to-1. So for every expense that was entered, we should have a source document. Go ahead and click on this choose file button over here to attach your source documentation and get that uploaded. Again, it should be one file with your source documentation. Also, please note the payment procedure down here at the bottom. Make sure that you're reading this to identify that if your payment request, once it gets submitted, is approved, then it means it's been reviewed and approved by the program manager and forwarded to the financial team to begin the payment process. So if you're submitting this and then receiving a notification that this has been approved, does not mean that it has been paid by the financial team just yet. It just means that it's been approved and forwarded on to the financial team so that they can begin processing the payment. So keep that in mind, that there'll be a delay between when you receive a notification from AmpliFund about this being approved and when you actually get paid for this reimbursement request. One more thing that I wanted to point out as we're looking at this reimbursement request, and before I click on the submit button to submit this over, is I wanted to point out this remaining grant balance field that we see here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click where it says my remaining grant balance. This is the same or a similar breakdown to what we saw on that first grant details page, where it's going to show you information about your spend activity to date, what you've submitted to date, and what your remaining grant balances are to date. So if we look at this first column over here, it's going to show us this is the total amount that we've expensed so far, including this request that we're looking at. It's showing us what we've invoiced so far, how much of that total is in pending invoices, how much has been approved, and also how much has been paid to date. Here, what's important to note is the remaining available grant funded and remaining available match amounts. So feel free to leverage this kind of interactive field over here in order to get a good idea of where you're at with your spending, how much you've expensed, how much is still outstanding in terms of what you've submitted and what you're waiting on response for, as well as what your remaining balances are. All right. So once we have all the requisite details populated in the reimbursement request, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on the submit button. Once I click on submit, you get this notification letting you know that once you click on submit, a notification will be submitted to your grant manager over at DEQ. Also, once you click on submit, no additional changes can be made to your expenses or the request that you're submitting. So it's kind of a second level of verification here. You will not be able to edit the expenses or this request once you click on submit unless it gets rejected. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the submit button. Once I do this, you'll get a success notification, and then also a notification gets sent to your grant manager at DEQ that this has been submitted. And keep in mind here, as we're looking at this payment request, you can see that now it shows up in a status of submitted, as well as providing you with a date submitted, and it shows who this was submitted by. Also, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, there's this payment request history where you can see that on 10/17, this payment request was created, and then a payment request for $350 was submitted, and it shows you the user that submitted this payment request. So once the request is submitted, as I mentioned before, your grant manager at DEQ gets a notification that this has been submitted and that they can take an action. Once they take an action, you will be notified. So, for example, if they are rejecting your payment request, you will receive a notification, and that notification will provide you with a reason why it was rejected and the ability to make any corrections. So let's take a look at this from the perspective of if we've submitted this and then it was rejected. If this was rejected, again, you would receive a notification in your email. Within that email would be a link for you to go and access the rejected payment request. And it's just, the navigation is the same. You'd be able to see it on your payment request list over here. Notice that your status is going to be rejected. You can click on it, or you can go directly to it to review the payment request and try to identify or see why it was rejected. There should be comments on this that tell you the specific reason why it was rejected. And if you go down to response, you'll be able to see that on October 17th, it was rejected for an incorrect expense amount. Now, I'm sure the rejection information will be much more detailed in terms of which expense you have to correct, or if you're missing some source documentation, whatever the reasoning may be. But at this point, you'll have the ability to go in and correct that expense or correct those expenses, and then resubmit this rejected request. So I'm going to go ahead and let's navigate to the expenses page where I'll be able to see those rejected expenses. So I'm going to go to post award, financial, and expenses. And I know that I have to, edit my expenses to match my source documentation for this payment request. I know that the payment request encompasses expenses from the September timeframe. So I could click on run, and that's going to give me every single expense from every date that was requested. Or I could just kind of narrow it down a little bit, and I can go to my time frame, choose a custom time frame, and say, show me all of my expenses from September 1st through September 30th. And then click run. And this makes it much easier for me to manage and view just those two expenses that I have submitted. Now, because the reimbursement request that I submitted these expenses on has been rejected, I have a pencil button next to each one of these expenses that's going to allow me to make any changes. So let's say that the mistake that I made originally was that, on this expense that had a total amount of $300, maybe I did the math wrong, and maybe it's not, 200 of grant funds plus 100 of match funds. Maybe it's, $200 total, and it's a 50-50 split with grant funds and match funds. So you can go in here and make the adjustment, go to your financials tab, make sure your cash match amount is still correct, and then go ahead and click on save. If there was an adjustment needed on your equipment expense, you would be able to make that too. Again, I think one of the common scenarios or reasons why an expense or a payment request would be rejected is if, the amount expensed or the amount requested didn't match the source documentation that was provided. And so I've made some changes here to my expense. And, one thing that I can do here is I can take a look at some of the different columns that are available to me on this grid. When we looked at the budget page, we're pointing out a little bit in terms of, what's important on that budget page to add in to make it kind of a viable report for you. We have similar options here on this expense grid where we have these different columns that contain the data. If you click on the drop down in any one of these columns, you can see and you can add more columns. So some of the columns that are particularly important or useful when looking at this expense grid here is maybe not necessarily the GL account, but seeing kind of the category, the line item, being able to see the total budgeted, total expensed, total remaining. These are good columns, and you can just kind of go through and click these on and off to get a good understanding or a good idea. One of the other useful tools when you do have this configured here is the ability to go in your top right-hand corner and export this. So if you wanted to run like another little mini report and export onto an Excel or a CSV, the information within this grid, then you can do that by navigating to the top right-hand corner here. Now that I've edited or corrected the rejected expenses, I can go back to my payment request, make sure that it looks good, and then resubmit. So I'm going to go back to my post-award menu, cash flow, and click on payment requests. I'm going to find my rejected request over here and click on the pencil button. I'm going to do a nice review just to make sure that what I'm going to resubmit is consistent with the changes that I've made and the feedback that was provided by DEQ. Again, one of the nice things here is that all the information is retained. And if the expenses that you either added or corrected fall within this time frame, then there's really no changes that are necessary over here. This expense grid should reflect the changes that were made. And we can see that here as my salaries and fringe, we changed from a total amount expensed of 300 to a total amount of 200, with 100 of that being the cash match amount. Now, because we made that change, the grant funded amount changed to $250. So I'm going to change my requested amount over here to $250. You'll see my supporting documentation is still locked in there. It's still attached. If anything in the source documentation needs to change, then you'll be able to make those changes as well. But if the initial upload with all the source documents are good and nothing needs to change there, then that'll remain in place and no change is necessary. In terms of supporting documents, again, the requirement here is going to be one upload that contains all of the separate source documents. The accepted file types for uploading into AmpliFund, there are a lot. PDF, Word documents, Excel documents, CSV, images, .msg messages, .txt text. So there's a number of different supported file types that are available for upload. Again, CSV, Excel, PDF, Microsoft Word, images. Those are typically the most common when it comes to uploading supporting documentation. On our support site, we also have a list of supported documentation. I can include that here in the chat for anybody that wants to access that, and then also make sure that it's part of the slides that we send to you as part of the follow-up today. So I've locked in my changes, make sure that my supporting documentation is good. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on submit. And as we are going through and looking at what we've submitted, we can click on the payment request button. And if we wanted to navigate back to our details page over here, you can click on the details. And very similarly to what we saw in terms of looking at that remaining balance section, here you're going to get a nice breakdown again of your spending activity to date. So here you're going to see the total amount that you've expensed to date, how much of that has been expensed in match contributions. You'll see an invoiced to date. So this is going to be a total amount of all payment requests that have been submitted, whether they've been approved, rejected, submitted, whatever it is. And if you click on it, then you'll get a breakdown of all the different payment requests, the dates that they were each submitted, and then the different statuses. Same thing for the total amount of pending invoices. So this is designed to show us how much has been submitted and how much is still outstanding or waiting on approval. You'll be able to click on the approved invoice box over here, which will allow you to see any of your approved payment requests, any payments that were made and that were recorded on file. And then importantly over here, being able to get access to your remaining available grant funded amount, your remaining available match requirement. So again, here, very important when we're looking at this in order to be able to kind of identify, what the spend activity has been to date, and then also being able to identify the calculations over here and how they've changed in terms of how much we have remaining for our grant funded, what's been budgeted on the grant funded level, as well as what's remaining on the match level. One thing that I also wanted to clarify when we're going in and we're looking at our payment requests and we're entering in those expenses. So I'm going to navigate over here to the cash flow and the payment request page. I'm going to pretend like I'm clicking a new one. I just wanted to show you and add in one additional thing when it comes to entering your expenses. So you click on the plus sign. Notice how we have this exclude from match. So we had talked about how you can identify matching funds, how you can enter in on your direct cost the total amount of grant funds plus match funds. We have this exclude from match button. It's important to know that we should not be ever checking this exclude from match box when entering an expense. So whether you're entering in an expense or not that has match funds, just don't check the box. Leave this box unchecked. Another question that we received in the chat is about if we're uploading one file for all documentation. And I believe the answer to that is that all of the source documents should be compiled into one file and should be uploaded here in the attachments. So you'll be uploading one file that will include all of the source documents. And I'll just pause again. We've gone through everything that I wanted to do on this refresher. I want to talk a little bit about our support site, but if you have any questions, now's a great time to submit those through the chat. I'll take a quick pause to see if we've had any more chat questions or Q&A questions come in before we move forward and do the a little review of the support site.
Just a question rather than using the chat. Can I just ask you a question? This is Stephen.
Go ahead.
The add expense box, is there once you open that and close it, is there a way to ever get back to it? Say you forgot to put your match in.
So you mean in terms of getting back to the expense, right?
Yes.
It's a great question. It's a great question. So let's pretend like I'm going to enter in an expense here for October. So let's go ahead and just do this real quick. So you create the expense here, and I'll just do this quickly. Let's say, I'm entering in my salaries expense, $200. I've forgotten to input my match. I see my expense here. How do I get back to it? So you can't get back to it from this page, but you can get to it on your expenses page. So at this point, I would go ahead and I would just create this, which allows you to, save any changes that you've made on the payment request so you can come back to it. So click on create. And then navigate back to the payment request screen so that you can get to your expenses page. Go to financial expenses. And then if you can click on run to see all of your expenses here. Scroll down and find the one that you want to edit. Click on the pencil button. And then now, if you missed $200 contribution, again, just go ahead and you can edit this expense, increase the amount, put in your match amount, and click on save. And that update will reflect when you go back to the payment request. So once you create the expense on the payment request screen, you won't be able to edit the expense on that screen, but you'll be able to go into your post-award financial expenses page, make that edit, and when you go back to your payment request, you'll see that change reflected on here if you've saved it. Stephen, does that help answer your question?
That does. Thank you so much.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions before we go and talk a little bit about the support site and do some wrap up? Just check in the chat box. All right. Feel free to just continue to chat those questions if you think of any right now. So the PowerPoint that you'll be provided with is going to contain some reference material. There's some slides with some screenshots about that are specific to some of the things that we've reviewed today. You have access to the AmpliFund support site. And on the support site here, we have our search bar. You can find user guides, some short videos, and information about upcoming trainings. I like using this search bar over here because it's pretty straightforward in terms of identifying, something that I'm looking for. So, for example, if, I was trying to determine what the supported file types are for upload, I can just kind of start typing in here file types, and I get some suggestions that may help. And then I can see my top article result here of what file types are allowed for uploading into AmpliFund. So there's a number of resources here on our support site. In addition, you can reach out to the AmpliFund customer support team by either going to your user drop-down menu here at the top right-hand corner and clicking on the help and support option, or you can go to the eye icon over here, and it's going to open up this window over here, which gives you a link to the support site or the ability to submit a support ticket. Submitting a support ticket or submitting a question to our support team about any AmpliFund technical issues or technical assistance, go ahead and type in the subject, a description of your question. If you wanted to include any screenshots, you could do that here. Once you submit the support ticket, it gets fired off to our support team, who will respond to your support request within, we have a maximum turnaround time of 2 hours. Usually it's a lot less than that. The hours are Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern time. If you submit a support ticket outside of business hours, it just gets picked up and worked the very next business day. So when you're in AmpliFund, you can click on that eye icon, submit a support ticket directly from here. We also have our AmpliFund Resource Center by clicking on the little AmpliFund logo at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. This has some really good onboarding guides, kind of interactive walkthroughs. So if you want to know, how to submit a payment request, or if you want to upload some documents, you can kind of click here and follow the prompts, and it'll take you where you can kind of follow it through and complete the actions. In terms of support and resources, I mentioned before, the previous trainings that were presented are available as recordings, as will today's training, and the slideshow will be available upon the conclusion of the session as well. So before we wrap up, any other questions or anything? I'm keeping my eye on the chat here. All right, it doesn't look like there's any other questions. Again, keep in mind, the AmpliFund support options. If you do have any questions, feel free to reference this video. I appreciate everybody's time today. Good luck with entering in your expenses and submitting your reimbursements, and we look forward to speaking with you in the future. Thank you all so much for your time today.
Thank you.